right.
Okay, let's get started. So good morning, everyone, and good evening in the United States. Welcome to the Kuala Lumpur, the World Bank's East Asia and Pacific Chief Economist Office Research Center in Kuala Lumpur, to our seminar series. And we are very happy to have Yatang Ling today with us from the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Yatang has a BA from Tsinghua University and an MA and a 2017 PhD in economics from LSE. And she has worked on regional and urban economics. She has, I've seen several papers out on China's high-speed rail network, which is what she's going to talk about today. And today she's looking at the effect of the network expansion on corporate locations. So as always, the typical housekeeping, and then we'll talk for about like 35 to 40 minutes. If you have any immediate questions on her presentation, please let me know through the chat. If not, we keep all the questions for after her talk. And then please let me know also through the chat if you have a question. You can either just write the question into the chat or just let me know that you would like to ask something. So Yatang, welcome. Please go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Tobias. Thanks, Shafat, as well, for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here to present my work on the impacts of high-speed railway in China on corporate investments. So needless to say, China's high-speed rail network has been one of the most important infrastructure program in the past few decades. Here we have a very insightful quote from Martin Reiser, the World Bank Country Director for China, about the impact of the Chinese railway system. It now allows a larger number of people to travel more easily and reliably than ever before, which brought a wide range changes to the local economic geography of China. And we are interested in evaluating such an important, especially passenger transportation infrastructure, which might set lessons to learn for other countries, because I think in the more recent decades, and increasingly attention has been focused on passenger transportation, and also argued by World Bank, which connects people to opportunities which might be important in countries with large regional frictions. So for our paper, we will look at a specific angle of the impacts of a Chinese high-speed rail system, which is its impact on the distribution and allocation of investment across space. We know that around the world, the spatial distribution of capital investments has been very uneven. In the case of China, more than 45% of the new fixed capital investments are concentrated in the East compared to the rest of the country, which backs us to a pretty much Lucas paradox type of question. Why we see why we observe a lack of investment flow, capital flows from rich regions, more developed regions to poor regions, where the capital is scarce. So we potentially would imagine the return to capital to be higher in regions, countries with a lack of capital instead of an abundance of capital. So the answer to Lucas, or the responses to Lucas' paradox, would be that there could either be underlying differences in the fundamentals between developed and developing world, which makes the return to capital fundamentally different. Or there might be restrictions to capital mobility across space, which prevents capital to flow from its abundant areas to the scarce areas. Our paper would contribute to this question by looking at whether or not transportation infrastructure, especially in this case, passenger transportation infrastructure, managed to promote capital mobility across cities. Especially to think from a conceptual perspective, transportation infrastructure would have an impact on private investments because it allows the transfer of people. People travel more reliably, more conveniently across different cities, which first facilitates the monitoring of a corporate headquarters on its potential subsidiaries considered to be set up in smaller cities. More frequent business trips could be made for the HQ's headquarters to exert controls on its subsidiaries. On the other hand, we could have simply a faster and more convenient way to exchange information, ideas through more frequent city-to-city travel. It reduces the information barrier of private investments. Suppose you travel to a city more, you're more likely to know people there, know the business world there, and discover new investment opportunities, which is a pure information acquisition story. So in this paper, we are trying to empirically investigate how the reduction in travel costs facilitates cross-city investments. So in doing that, we combine a panel of city-to-city investment in China, compiled using unique administrative data on fund registration with plausibly exogenous shocks to travel cost, to passenger travel cost from the expansion of high-speed railway system in China. Specifically, we are interested in the mechanisms at work in the sense that we want to separate or make an effort to separate the monitoring story, which presents in the relationship between the headquarter control and subsidiary investments, and non-controlling investment, which we believe would reflect more like an exchange of information stories. We'll look at sectoral and regional heterogeneity. Most importantly, we're interested in knowing whether or not the expansion of high-speed rail system and the reduction in travel cost reduces the capital return gaps between cities in China, whether or not this network, these rail connections indeed induce capital to flow from richer to poorer regions. So in terms of literature, there is a very big literature on the home bias of investment. Basically, there has been this universal, robust, and consistent data pattern on investors tend to invest very close to home. And a natural response would be this is an information story. People are more interested, are more concerned about investment near their hometown and into the stocks, equity, VC investments that they're mostly familiar with. Again, there could be information story versus monitoring story. And the downside of home bias is that it suggests that investors are potentially passing up a lot of good, distant investment opportunities, which also leads to the under-diversification of their investments portfolio across space. So our paper will contribute to the home bias literature by exploiting this exogenous shock to monitoring and information cost, thanks to the expansion of the high-speed rail network. So I think I probably don't need many words on passenger high-speed rail in China. The network started expansion since 2003, and now the high-speed rail network has been over 20,000 kilometers. And the speed is about 250 to 350 kilometers per hour. So this has been its expansion timeline. As you can see, in 2016, there had been a pretty extensive network. With respect to our outcome, we are collecting firm registration data from we obtain the data from the State Administration for Industry and Commerce. This is the government's authority in charge of firm registration. We collect administrative information for the whole universe of enterprises in China. There are over 10 million registered firms. At registration, all firms are required to disclose their legal representatives, shareholders, executives, value of a registry, capital, the location of firm, industry code, and so on. So the data allows us to trace investments across space. So suppose you see a firm in Shanghai has been set up, and one of its shareholder contribute a certain amount of capital from firm based in Beijing. We kind of count an investment flow from Beijing to Shanghai. So in that way, we're able to aggregate investment flows at city pair month level, which is directional from 2000 to 2015. Directional in the sense that investment flow from Beijing to Shanghai and from Shanghai to Beijing are two different investment flows. We focus on firm-to-firm investments because it's easier to locate firms than individual shareholders, and the firm-to-firm investments account for most of the investment flows in our database. And we focus on investment flows related to the establishment of new firms. So this is a figure on the geographical distribution of firm investments inflows. So we're looking at the destination of capital flows from 2005 to 2015. I'm sorry, the figures are a little bit broad. But my main takeaway would be there are more cities receiving a higher amount of investments in 2015 than 2005. In 2005, investment flows are pretty much concentrated in Beijing, Shanghai, Guangdong, and Chongqing. So, but in 2015, you can see the receivers of capital become more diversified across space. So our main regression equation is to evaluate the response of cross-city investment to potentially exogenous establishment of city-to-city high-speed rail connections. So there are two measurements of cross-city investments. Are first the number of unique firm-to-firm investments. So how many firms are making investments in another firm located in different cities. And then an intensive margin measure, which is total amount of investments in RMB. So our measures of high-speed rail connections, the very basic measurement is a dummy that switches to 1 if two cities has been directly connected at one origin and one destination city has been directly connected by a particular year. So by direct connection, we mean these two cities should be located on one high-speed rail line that opened at the same date. So in this regression, our variation is at city pairs, origin, destination, month level. So it allows us to control for high dimensional fixed effects, including city pair fixed effects, which capture the pre-existing connections between cities, including geographical, social, cultural distances, as well as origin mounts and destination mounts fixed effects. So these two city mounts fixed effects captures all shocks at city or economic shocks, monthly economic shocks at city level, including city GDP, and along those lines. So we're really exploiting the within city pair time level variations in connection status. So in our sample, we restrict to all the city pairs that have been ever connected. We're really exploiting the difference between early connectors and later connectors. So our baseline regression results is that high-speed rail connection leads to an 8% increase in the unique number of investments and about 40% increase in the total amount of investments. And you might wonder that despite the control of high-dimensional fixed effects, there is still the concern that high-speed rail connection status, the railway authority would target at city pairs specifically that had been expected to become closer over time. If we believe that controlling for origin and destination, the trend in bilateral investment, expectation about bilateral investment might be correlated with high-speed rail connection status. We are thinking of another identification strategy based on the idea that the Chinese high-speed rail system is very extensive for horizontal, for vertical line system, which connects over 100 cities. And the very extensive network pretty much picks up a lot of connections along the way, which could not be well planned in advance. So when they're connecting over 100 cities, there are maybe more than 2,000, 3,000 individual bilateral connections. A lot of them cannot be thought as well planned in advance. We're trying to collect information on the indirectly connected city pairs, defined as city pairs that get connected, indirectly connected, when a horizontal line gets connected with a vertical line. So when the horizontal line and a vertical line get joined together, we take all the non-nodal cities from both lines to be indirectly connected. So one example of indirect connection is here we have a vertical line from Changsha to Guangzhou and a horizontal line from Kunming to Shanghai and passing Changsha. And you can imagine when these two lines gets joined together, Shaoguan, a city just north to Guangzhou, along the Changsha-Guangzhou line, and Yichun, a city to the east of Changsha, they got connected through Changsha. And you can imagine these two cities, not being the nodal cities, might not be the primary focus for these two lines to get joined together. We kind of take their connection as an indirect connection as a result of the network trying to connect maybe Shanghai to Guangzhou. So we define this indirect connect dummies, and we restrict our attention to samples of city pairs that had never been directly connected. In another way, we focus on the sample side, the sample which exclude pairs such as Shanghai to Guangzhou, Guangzhou to Shenzhen cities, the cities that have been directly connected, comparing indirectly connected cities to never connected cities. So here are some of the additional results on the indirect connection. As we can see, the effects are smaller, but they're statistically significant. The size is about half of the size of the direct connection dummy. In addition, we run a typical event study type of analysis, where we include a dummy that switches to 1 during the period of announcement. So we are exploring the announcement effects as well as pre-announcement effect. The announcement dummy switches to 1 during the period before high-speed rail connection and the announcement of the line, typically the construction starting date of the line. And we also define a dummy that switches to 1 for all the months 1 year before the announcement. We should expect pre-announcement dummy to be insignificant to support our parallel trend assumption. And for the announcement dummy, it also don't show up with any effects, which suggests that the high-speed rail impacts exert itself only after the real connection events that happen. The impacts on high-speed rail on investment are only possible after the operation of these lines, that people could travel more frequently, they discover the new opportunities. A lot of these are not about expectations. So these are our main results. We proceed with several additional analysis. Also interesting some heterogeneity analysis, and we are interested in exploring whether or not high-speed railway could close up regional investment return gaps. So our first heterogeneity analysis looks at controlling versus non-controlling stakes. So as I said, there could be 2 potential mechanisms at work. One is that the closer headquarter subsidiary relationship makes investors more capable of monitoring the activities of their subsidiaries in another city. And the other mechanism is that investors are now able to discover new information and figure out new investment opportunities much easier when they're traveling to other cities more frequently. It's hard to separate out these 2 mechanisms, but we are trying to divide investments into controlling versus non-controlling stakes. So non-controlling stakes would be investment flows where the investors are only holding a very small share of investment amount at the destination company, at the invested company in a city. So our argument would be for this non-controlling stake, or like investments where the investors are only holding a very small share of capital, they are not likely to be the controller of the destination companies, and they're not likely to have very active control on the destination companies. So we can follow this as a pure investment instead of a monitoring story. Pure information other than monitoring story. On the other hand, controlling stake, where the investors are holding over 50% or even close to 100% being the sole owner of the investees, they're likely to exert monitoring efforts on the destination companies. So as you can see, the effects are the treatment effects of high-speed rail on all these different kinds of investments are consistent. They're much larger for sole ownership, which kind of suggests that the monitoring story exists and appears to be important. But the treatment effects also exist for all the other below 100% ownership relationship investments. And the magnitudes do not drop by a lot, even if we look at the very small ownerships, the small investors, which seem to suggest that other than the monitoring story, the information acquisition, the discovery of new opportunities story seems to also hold here. And similar patterns have been observed for indirect connection as well. So another exercises we had is to look at the differential treatment effects across industries. We divide industries into about 12 of them by the industry code of destination companies. And we discover the largest effects for firms in the science, research, and tech, leasing and business service, real estate, IT, retail trade. We see almost no impacts on manufacturing, construction. Mostly manufacturing, it's pretty precise, zero effects. And if you look at the relationship between treatment effects across industries to the skill contents of this industry, you're going to observe a positive relationship between the education of the workers in this industry and the impacts of high-speed rail. So I believe that the impacts of high-speed rail on corporate investments are more important in this industries dependent on high-skilled workers and the knowledge, the information of high-skilled workers who would benefit more from travel through the availability of high-speed rail. Another interesting aspect we explore is these aspects of regional inequality. Whether or not high-speed rail reduces regional inequality in investments by alleviating the information asymmetry. So one idea is that the Lucas paradox type of argument within a country, the why capital doesn't flow from richer part of the country to poor parts of the country, is related to asymmetric information. So there might be higher information barriers for investors from more developed, rich areas to invest in poor areas, other than the other way around. So the information barrier might be asymmetric, which means the reduction in travel cost might have an asymmetric treatment impacts on rich to poor region investment versus poor to rich region investments. So we divide cities into 3 types: rich city, middle income city, and poor city according to their 2000 GDP per capita. And we divide the investment. So here we have 3 types of cities. Those 3 times 3, there will be 9 types of bilateral flow: rich to poor, rich to middle, rich to rich. We just categorize them into 3 groups. First, there might be investment to the same groups, so rich to rich, middle to middle, poor to poor. To higher group would be middle to rich, poor to rich, poor to middle, and to lower group would be investments flows to cities poorer than you. The results are not super different across these three groups. In general, we see larger treatment effects for investment flows between similar cities. You're more likely to invest in cities that are at the same income level as you. And if we just compare the higher versus lower groups, the effects are larger for on the 2 lower group categories. So it's high-speed rail will facilitate the investments from rich to poor regions more than the other way around. which kind of partially confirms our previous guess that the high-speed rail network, the reduction in travel costs had the bigger impacts in removing investment frictions from rich to poor regions. Another heterogeneity analysis we run is to look at urban clusters. We know the development of high-speed rail in China has been cited as instrumental in China's ground plan of developing urban clusters, which is intended to foster integration of cities into clusters. So we are interested in first whether or not high-speed railway mainly promote investments within or across clusters. And secondly, if you look at clusters, they're typically consisting of several hubs and several core cities, several peripheral cities. Are high-speed railway centralizing force or decentralizing forces within cities? So are they directing investments from the core city of an urban cluster to its periphery cities, or we don't see a particular pattern along those lines? So this is our results. First, we look at the within versus across clusters. A little bit surprising is that the treatment effects are 100% concentrated for within cluster investments. We don't see a lot of investment across urban clusters. They exist mostly within clusters. So if you look at within clusters, the travel time between cities by high-speed railway would be just below 1 hour, 2 hours. So it kind of suggests that high-speed railway would promote travel flows between cities that are close enough. So if you have to travel by high-speed railway from Beijing to Shanghai, it takes more than 5 hours. That would exert relatively low impacts on the investment flows. People really need to be able to travel within 2 hours, 1 hour, within 2 hours at least, to see a pretty large treatment effect. And we then divide cities within a cluster into core versus peripheral cities. So we can see core to core, core to peripheral, peripheral to core, peripheral to periphery. And the effects, we now focus on all the within cluster investment flows. And what you can see is that the effects are largest with core to peripheral investments, as well as periphery to periphery investments. We see almost no impacts on periphery to core flow, which kind of suggests that the high-speed rail or reduction in travel cost seems to be a decentralizing force. When we look at city-to-city investment, they're directing capital from the core cities of the urban cluster to the smaller cities around it. And if you look at heterogeneity on 2 dimensions, so among these core peripheral flows, which industries would experience the largest impacts? It's still consistent with our industry heterogeneity analysis. The core peripheral flows are most pronounced in leasing and business services, real estates, and scientific research and technology. So the high skill, high value added service industries. In general, these 2 information put together kind of suggest a picture on the decentralizing of high skill, high value added sectors within urban clusters. So we can only speculate on what might be happening. My guess is that high-speed rail allows the kind of encourage these high-skilled sectors who originally would locate in their headquarters in very large, very cities with strong agglomeration effects. But now the reductions in travel costs allows them to set branches or kind of set other businesses closer to their customers in smaller cities. and potentially along the way, the reduction in travel costs also allow their mid-level managers to be willing to be sourced from the core cities with better amenities out to periphery cities with the possibility of commuting back to urban centers. It's a trend for high-skilled workers to be more likely to be based in smaller cities. Our final empirical exercise is to look at whether or not high-speed rail has the potential of closing investment return gaps. So we aggregate firm level profits to assets. Which in our definition is a measure of capital return, which is the share of firm level profit to its assets, from a subsample of firm inspection data to city industry level. So here, basically, because our major data source is the firm registration data, we don't see a lot of the firm information on the universe of firm registration data. On the other hand, we kind of have a very small subset of these registered firms who receive random inspections from the same authority. The inspection data, the kind of random firm inspection would give us information on the firm's profits and assets and all this business information. So we just take this small, potentially random subset of firms and calculate their profit to asset weighted by asset as the capital return of these firms, aggregating up to city industry level. We're specifically interested in two questions. First, would the high-speed rail treatment effects to be larger between city industry pairs with larger gap in capital investment flow, in capital investment return? So the idea would be if the return is larger, it means that there will be larger gains for capital to flow in this direction. You would expect them to respond more to a reduction in information cost, which is indeed the case. We see much larger effects, much larger high-speed rail connection effects for between city with higher return, with higher gap in return. And the second question would be, will the expansion of high-speed railway reduce the capital return over time? This data is a little bit noisy in the sense that we don't have a full panel of investment return calculation. But indeed, we find that this is the results. So we are looking at whether or not the return to capital gap at city industry year responds directly to high-speed rail dummies. So does high-speed railway closes up the capital return gap? It's a noisy analysis because, as I said, we don't observe this capital return data for a lot of cities. But our general regression results seem to suggest that the gap is smaller, respond to connection when we control for city pair fixed effects. But if we throw in the other higher dimensional fixed effects, the results go away, potentially because it captures the greater proportion of variation in the outcome data. I think I'm almost using up my time, so I would like to conclude here. So our research suggests that the internal capital market is pretty much influenced by travel cost. The reduction in travel costs across base, thanks to the expansion of the passenger infrastructure, transportation infrastructure network in China, helps to facilitate the geographical distribution of internal financing. which allowed firms in developed cities to be more diversified in their investment portfolios across smaller cities. It also allows firms in underdeveloped cities to receive capital from other parts of the country. And we observe evidence for both mechanisms of the ease of monitoring and better information acquisition, easier discovery of new investment opportunities in smaller cities. We also find the integration of cities within urban clusters. Effects most exist within urban clusters through the decentralization of investments from core cities to peripheral cities, especially in the high-skilled, high-value-added service sectors. We also find some suggestive evidence that the reduction in travel costs also close up capital return gaps between cities. That's all for my presentation. Thanks a lot, and I'm looking forward to your comments and feedback.
Thank you, Yatang. Great presentation and great paper. You had a lot of material in there, so that's very impressive. And I think what you presented now was a lot more than what I've seen in the draft beforehand. We are now opening up the floor for questions, and I have a number of questions, but first there was a question that rolled in towards the end of your presentation. And this is that Yen O wants to know what data sources you use, and in particular, if you collected any primary data for your analysis.
It's an administrative database. It's data collected by the state administration of industry and commerce. So it's an authority that's in charge of firm registration. So when the firm gets registered, the information is going to be recorded by this government authority. We kind of obtain data from that office. I think the data will be it's not our access to the data is not publicly available. I think the firm registration data itself is publicly available. It's just I think there are websites publishing information on registered firms. You can run queries, but it's just it's hard to scrap data from public sources. You can run queries about whether or not a particular firm is registered at which time, but it's hard to get a complete panel. So our access is from the office itself. And also we have this firm inspection data, which is kind of supposed to be restricted access one.
Okay, thank you. I have a couple of questions / comments. I mean, a little bit more technical in nature. I mean, you cover a lot of ground looking at all these different specifications.
Yes.
But in the presentation, you were a little short, I think, on presenting the actual model you were estimating and the actual data structure you were using. And I mean, what I take from your working paper is that in most specification you use a binary treatment variable, which is connection versus non-connection. Then you have some other specifications there where you use a measure of actual time savings. And
yes, this is our main specification. Yeah. So you can think of this as a reduced form. You can imagine the high-speed rail connection. I don't know whether or not it's a point you're making. High-speed rail connection would affect travel time first. And reduction in travel time would have an impact on investment flows.
Okay, and the connect variable is binary, right?
It's binary. Yeah.
So it starts at 0, switches to 1, but then never switches back.
Yes.
Now, I mean, there are two.
Switches back. Yeah.
So I mean this is essentially difference in difference estimation, and there has been a lot of work, I mean, coming out the last 3 years or something, that essentially state that this traditional that when you have more than the canonical model with like 2 time periods and 1 treatment, 1 control group that these estimates tend to be biased.
Yes, I'm aware
So
of that. Yeah, it's before that. Like all the regressions have been run before the DID revolution.
yeah, okay,
I
good.
guess
Okay, this is something you're working on right now.
yes. It's because here we have to run the data at the server of this office.
Okay.
So we kind of need to revamp everything if we want to. Yeah, I think their problem is more about we shouldn't have I think their result is we can compare the early we can compare the never treated cities would appear to be good control group to treated cities. But the early treated cities, for some early treated cities, the connection dummy never switches back, and in the later periods of time, they serve as the control pairs to the later treated pairs, and that would be a bad comparison.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is one point. The other point is that there's also some weighting issues in the parameter.
Yes.
Okay, good.
That's indeed.
Okay, good. So you have your work cut out on that front. A second question was, do you put any spatial structures on your error terms? Because what you have in there is you have a connection, you essentially have a directional connection from city I to city J, right?
Yes.
So then you also have the opposite pair as a separate observation in your sample.
Yes.
And then, of course, all the cities are connected to the other cities. So when you think about this error term structure, shouldn't there be a correlation in the error term? So city I and city J are connected, but then are also cities K and city L are connected. And of course, these two pairs would be independent. But then you also have city I or city J respectively connected to the city K and city L. And that this should be taken into account in the error term structure in like a spatial fashion.
Yes, at the moment we cluster our standard errors to city pair. We have a two-way cluster at city pair and mods. So I guess it's like the traditional practice for panel data where we cluster at both I and T. But your suggestion would be we need to
more like a spatial econometrics clustering, because I mean you can think about the error term here of EIJT to have at least time invariant unobserved for city I and for city J.
Yes.
And these same unobserved would be then in the connection of city I with city K, or city J with city L.
Yes.
So there should be some structure in the correlation of these error terms. Unless you connect two completely different pairs of cities, there should be some correlation in the error terms, the variance-covariance matrix.
Yes, it would be hard. Like, yeah, I understand the spatial econometrics literature when our unit of analysis is at IT level. So and the cities that might be closer to each other are more correlated. But here we have a IJ level, and it's we need to give some thinking about what kind of pairs are more closely correlated to other pairs.
Right. I mean, I agree. That would be like, this would be taking it one step further to also take into account the distance between the cities.
Yes, it's because the distance matters for both origin and destination.
Yeah. I mean, distance is something else, but what I was referring to is just this idea that the error term between city I and city J should be correlated with the error term between city I and city K, just because it should contain the same unobservables.
Yes.
For city I.
Yes, I agree. Yes, we need to consider like all the connections by the same origin and all the connections with the same destination. Yes. Okay.
Okay,
Right.
great. Thank you. Okay, there's another question here from Jen O, but before I read it, does anyone else have a question? Or Yatang? If not, let me just read this question, because I think it's an important one. It says China's connectivity improvement was not just high-speed rail, but also massive expansion of expressways and civil aviation over the similar period. Did you consider travel time reduction by these other modes? Otherwise, do you think the results could change if you did that? So I think this essentially boils down to this idea that there were like in the same travel corridors, you had like other investments in transportation infrastructure, and they could potentially act as omitted variables if not properly controlled for. And you would attribute them to high-speed rail, even if they may be driven by other modes of transportation.
Yes, yes, indeed, that's a great question. So at the moment, I think no. So we haven't controlled for this bilateral relationship. We have obviously controlled for origin months and destination months, which should capture a lot of the treatment at city level. But if you're referring to a specific pairwise connection by air in the same time as high-speed rail, we haven't controlled for that. We are worried less about expressway. I think the massive expansion of expressway kind of predated the expansion of high-speed rail. For civil aviation, I think our main treatment of effects of high-speed railway are concentrated for cities that are not too far away from each other. Right. So the air and high-speed railway would have very different treatment effects over cities across different distance range.
Mm. Okay, but did you take that into account in your analysis when you used the actual travel time treatment? That
Yes,
also travel time for air traffic may have changed?
Yes, we haven't. Yeah, we should have done this better. Like we haven't controlled directly for air connection, but we do have air connection data. So we did some additional analysis on the impacts of on the elasticity of travel time, on the response of investments to travel time. We define monthly bilateral travel time as the minimum of travel time across 4 transportation modes, which is the expressway, high-speed rail, traditional train, and air. We take a minimum between across these 4 modes. And you can imagine if the pairs has been connected by air, the treatment effects of high-speed rail on travel time might be much smaller. On the extreme case, high-speed rail doesn't affect the travel time between pairs because they have already been connected by a faster mode of transportation, such as air. So if you think the air connection might be a confounding factor, the travel time regression sort of switches off for city pairs that have been connected by air. You can think of this as a you can think of the dummies, high-speed rail connection dummies, and so on as an intention to treat measures, and travel time as more like the true treatment that we think should happen.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you. There's one more question that just came in, and this is from Somesh. And it says, can network analysis be used with nodes, edges, closeness, centralization? So I'm not fully sure what this refers to. I don't know. So much, would it possible for you to just come on and ask your question directly. If not, let me just repeat this question. Maybe it makes, because I'm not 100% sure what is meant by nodes, edges, and closeness centralization. Do you, Yatang?
No,
Repeat the
me,
question. Can
I'm
network
not
analysis be
familiar
used with
with
nodes, edges,
network.
and closeness centralization?
Yes, I will look into that. I think it's super interesting because obviously the connection. I take this as more like exploring the heterogeneity of a connection between different parts of the network. We did something about core peripheral relationship, but it's not really in the language of a network analysis. I imagine there could be a higher level analysis on what kind of city pair play a greater role in the network. Are the treatment effects to be larger if we think about city pairs that's potentially would connect other pairs that are central to the connections of a lot of other pairs. So we haven't really explored that literature, but I think it would be a very interesting angle to look at as well. Like what I guess the bigger problem will be is you have many different bilateral connections. Which connection would have a greater impact on the whole network?
Okay. Thank you. Then let me quickly check. Okay, are there any other questions? Please put them in the chat or quickly chime in directly. If there are no more questions, then we are pretty much out of time. So I very much would like to say, Yantang, before we close shop, I posted in the chat, please go to the chat and look at the SurveyMonkey link there. So we would really appreciate if you could fill out that really short survey. It will take you 10 seconds, not more. Just a couple of questions you quickly have to click on, and it would help us improve our seminar series.
Yes, thanks a lot.
So thanks a lot, Yantang. Great paper, great work. And a lot of stuff, very, very comprehensive. And I'm looking forward to read the next version of it.
Yes, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the comments and the suggestions. Thank you. Good day.
Thank you, and thanks a lot everyone for attending. So, and a good night in the Americas and a good morning in Asia.
Yes, good day.